Hey everyone. Today we're talking about loading and using external sample kits and having a little fun with a step sequencer. If you just want to see this thing making beats, you can find the timestamps for that down in the description. Let me throw up my floating screen again and let's get started. So you can see that at startup we boot right into the subtractive synthesizer I demoed in the last video. This time, however, we have a few additional tabs tied to these function buttons up here. So in addition to the synth mode, which is attached to the first button here, we can also enter a sampler mode with the second button, or a sequencer mode with this third button. And once I get around to programming it, the fourth button will hopefully navigate to some kind of tape or recording mode. As you can notice, at the moment, each of these modes only really has one option for using it. I'm hoping to eventually be able to get a few synthesizers, FM, wavetable, etc., a few different types of sequencers, and be able to sample from a few different sources, just so whoever's using it can have a good amount of flexibility in the options they have for making their music. Anyway, let's talk about what we do have right now, and first up is the sample browser. What you see on my screen right now is a pretty rudimentary file browser, which is showing us the contents of this SD card. Now using my computer, I've gone ahead and loaded up this 32 gig card with about 2 gigs worth of free audio sample packs I found online, just to create a little sample library I can use for this demo. Of course, you can store as many samples as you want here, as long as they're in the WAV format and fit within the limits of the SD card. While copying the samples onto the SD card, I threw them into a few folders to categorize them, and we can see those folders being displayed here. You can tell these are directories and not actual audio files from the cute little folder icons to the left. Now as usual, we can use the encoder to navigate to the folder that we want to open, and click to enter it, which brings up its contents. I've just opened up my 808s folder, and we're now met with a long list of the files and folders stored in here. Playable WAV files are marked with a little pink music note icon, while all non-audio files are marked with a gray X to indicate that they can't be used as samples. Now we can go through this very long list and preview any of the sample files we see. And like I mentioned before, you can throw as many samples as you want onto the SD card, and you can even include subdirectories as long as you keep the file names relatively short. As indicated by this little graphic in the upper left-hand corner, pushing the green encoder brings us back to the home directory. Now we have a big collection of samples, but how do we actually make use of them? This brings me to these 12 buttons here, which make up the sample pad. At any one time, we have the ability to load up to 12 samples into our kit, each of which is triggered by these buttons. Now let's say we're making a beat that involves some kind of vocal sample. Let's scroll through this list and try to pick one out. This one's alright. We can go ahead and select it, which brings us to our assignment screen. I want to assign it to this button right here, where you can hear I've already loaded in some kind of open hi-hat sample. We want to replace this with our vocal chop, so we can go ahead and hold down our select key and press the button that we want to bind the sample to. Now the next few things are going to go by pretty quick, so before I bind the sample, I'll give you a little heads up of what's about to happen. Now the SD card here is relatively slow at transferring data in and out, so we can't really play all of our samples off of it directly, especially if we want to be playing multiple samples at the same time. For better performance, we need to copy the audio data of the samples we're interested in to a faster form of memory, like serial flash. The serial flash chip I have soldered in, somewhere in the back of this board, is approximately 16 megabytes in size, and that space is divided into 12 files, each mapped into one of the buttons on our sample pad here. When we bind a sample using this menu, as I'll do in just a second, the corresponding serial flash file is erased and rewritten with the raw audio data of the sample that we bind. As you'll see, this operation does take a second or two to complete. And there we go. Our sample is now bound to the desired button, and we can trigger it whenever we want. Now the sample is playing directly off of the much faster serial flash memory instead of the SD card. In a similar way, I've also gone ahead and loaded samples into the other buttons on the sample pad.
Go! What? Go! Go! Go!
Another feature of using serial flash, for better or for worse, is that the data stored is non-volatile, which means if we power off the device and turn it back on,
Go! What?
the samples will still be bound. To make a long story short, all you gotta do is copy the sounds you want to use onto the SD card. They'll show up on the screen, and you can just click to assign it to any of the sample buttons. Now that we have our sample kit chosen, we can make some minor modifications to the way it sounds. Entering the editor here, we can select a sample to edit, and we're shown another screen where we can adjust the envelope for that sample as well as its relative loudness. After we build the kit and adjust its sound, we can finally move on to the sequencer. Now this is a pretty straightforward step sequencer, and we can throw notes onto the grid here, and the little playhead will trigger the sound as it passes. For the time being, the sequence length is fixed at 8 bars, each with 4 beats, but you can usually play around with the layout and the tempo to get what you're looking for. These 8 bars are split across 2 screens, so we can see our first 4 bars here, and scrolling to the right shows us the last 4. Once we're here, we can go ahead and place a sample by holding down the select button and pressing the corresponding key, which puts a little pink dot on the grid. Pressing it again in the same location removes the sample from the sequence. We can manually scroll to where we want to place a sample on the sequence, or we can hit the play button here and lay down our samples live. We can of course go back to edit the sample placement, or just hit this button to clear the sequence completely. The blue encoder here controls the direction of the playback. So we have forwards, backwards, or random, which does get a little chaotic when we're just using drum samples. Let me try to put together something a little bit more coherent so I can show you what the sequencer really sounds like. Now, I don't really know what I'm doing, but I've loaded the pad up with sounds that I kind of understand, so let's have a go at this. I like to start with a little bed of hi-hats, and then build on top of that. Let's sprinkle in a little bit of this 808 sound. And that's a little oversaturated with the hi-hats, so I'll go ahead and delete some of those. And maybe I'll add some back in there just to spice it up a little bit. Let's do some there. And maybe a couple extra here. Okay, I like that. It's a little bottom heavy though, so let's do a couple of snare hits maybe. I think I'm going to shift this back a little bit. And do the same with these two. Sort of in a similar pattern. And move this one back as well. Let's listen to what that sounds like. Alright, I'm going to remove the 808 from here, and here, and here. Okay, Okay, and maybe a couple of these crunchy snaps. Okay, I'm into that. I would like the hi-hats to be a little bit louder maybe, and we can do that pretty easily by going back to the sampler section and editing that sound. And there we go. If I return to the sequencer, you can hear that the settings have indeed been carried through. You might be wondering, where's the synth in all of this? For now, I only have the sequencer working with the sample pad. And really the main reason I haven't done the same for the synth here is because there just isn't enough screen real estate to show 24 additional dots for each of the synth keys. I'll have to look for either a different way to represent that visually or put together a different kind of sequencer just for the synth. We can, however, run the sequence beat and just jam over it with the synth. Let me try to put together a simpler beat just so I don't get confused. I'll start by erasing this one. I'll also go back to the synth section and make some adjustments to get a more appropriate sound. Just for fun, we can add a little envelope modulator in here. We'll assign that to the filter. Great. I like how that's sounding. Let's head back to the sequencer. Oh, and I did forget to mention, pressing the first button here, along with the select button, brings up the output mixer screen where we can control the relative volumes of the synth and the samples using these sliders. I'll just bump up the synth volume just a tad. Great. Now we can go back to the sequence and just mess around. So as you can see, it's definitely a lot of fun to play around with. I'm working on adding hopefully a lot more features, so stick around for that. If you guys have any suggestions or concerns, please let me know down below in the comments, and as usual, you'll find the code for this linked in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.